I don't like machines. I never have. When my friends laugh about it, calling me a technophobe who's behind the times, I just laugh with them. It's easier than trying to explain the truth. They don't see what I see. When they look at the precise, relentless movements of a machine, they see efficiency and progress. Me, on the other hand, I see a merciless, thoughtless killer. If my friends knew about what happened on Meadow View Lane back in 1998, they might agree. I lived there with my mother Beth, my father Harry, and our golden retriever Hoops. In those days, it seemed like a clean, peaceful place to grow up. And maybe that was because, at 9 years old, I couldn't see the evil brewing beneath the surface of our quiet suburb. The names Karen Hightower, Emily Buell, and Jennifer Trent meant next to nothing to me back then. They were just 3 more of the interchangeable adults who my mother chatted with for what felt like hours when they ran into each other at the grocery store. Only once did my mother make a strange comment about one of them, and the sharpness of it stuck in my mind like a splinter. "Don't you ever make Karen Hightower angry, Ellie," she sniffed. "We don't want her as our enemy. We can't afford it." My mother had been running her fingers through my hair while she spoke, something I usually hated, but I didn't pull away that day. I'd realized that my mother was crying, but I couldn't understand why. She'd only been talking to boring old Mrs. Trent in the parking lot. What could she possibly have said that was so upsetting? It was only later, at Mr. Trent's funeral, that I began to put the pieces together. Although the preacher had talked a lot about passing away and moving on to a better place, the adults whispered a much more sinister word when they thought Mrs. Trent wasn't listening. Suicide. When my father finally explained what that word meant when we got back home, I hugged Hoops and cried into his fur for reasons I couldn't explain. Arthur Trent had been an auto salesman, a beefy man with a black mustache who was always surrounded by that new car smell. He'd hosted excellent barbecues, and once gave me $10 at a yard sale for a toy Mustang that we both knew wasn't worth 5 cents. How could a person like that just kill themselves? Based on my mother's strange comment, I figured it had something to do with Karen Hightower, and I started avoiding the Queen of Meadow View Lane even more than I had before. It was my father who'd given her that nickname, then made me swear to never use it in her presence, even though it was obvious why it was funny. Karen Hightower was on every committee, from the Homeowners Association to the PTA, and since her husband was a policeman, she walked around like she was wearing his gun and handcuffs on her hips. If a neighbor painted their shed the wrong color or left their children's toys in the yard, it was guaranteed that Karen Hightower would be there with a complaint, a fine, or even a threat of arrest. I usually avoided her house when I took Hoops for a walk, terrified of what she'd do if he lifted a leg on her lawn. As it turned out, what happened was much worse. I don't know how Hoops escaped from our fenced-in backyard, but the big, silly golden retriever somehow made his way to the Hightower's house, where he dug up most of Karen Hightower's rose bushes. Or at least, that's what we think must have happened. We never really learned the truth, because Hoops never made it back home that evening. Or ever. When he still wasn't home by midnight, I tiptoed to the top of the stairs and listened in on a hushed conversation happening below. Emily Buell had come by to share some gossip. Apparently, Karen Hightower had been furious when she'd seen what Hoops had done to her garden. She'd had one of her husband's pals from animal control take him to the pound, and put him down for being a vicious dog, even though Hoops had never bitten anyone in his life. "That bitch!" my father roared after Emily Buell left. I winced at the sound of his whiskey tumbler shattering against the brick fireplace. "Keep your voice down," my mother scolded. "Or do you want us to end up like the Trents? You think you're the only one who's hurting here?" I held my breath during a long, tense silence. "Listen, honey, it's going to be okay. I'll tell Ellie that Hoops ran away. We'll get him a new dog this weekend, okay?" But I didn't want a new dog. I wanted Hoops back. And if I couldn't have that, at the very least, I wanted to get back at Karen Hightower for what she'd done. And, as it turned out, I wasn't the only one. After my mother told me a made-up story about Hoops running away, I sunk into a deep depression. My parents' attempts to play basketball with me in the driveway, take me out for ice cream, or even buy me a new video game console were all met with the same apathetic shrug. I spent my days staring out the window, watching the sky change from orange to purple to black over the perfectly trimmed lawns of Meadow View Lane. As I did, I began to notice that something strange was happening in Mrs. Trent's garage. Prior to her husband's death, Jennifer Trent had been as delicate as any of the housewives in our neighborhood. But now, suddenly, she was dragging canvas sacks of scrap metal in and out of her house at night. Based on the thick gloves, hood, and secondhand textbooks I saw her leave the house with each day, she was even taking classes in welding. Although Jennifer Trent came home from those courses, filthy and exhausted, she always went right to work on her own project, in the garage. I could see the haunting light of an arc welder's flame burning inside, and if I opened my window, the sooty smell of soldering wafted into my room. In a way, it was no surprise that Mrs. Trent had taken up such solitary activities. A few weeks after the funeral, when the condolence cards and casserole parades had finally come to an end, people had started avoiding Jennifer Trent. Whether it was because of a natural fear of death or because of something to do with Karen Hightower, I couldn't tell. All I knew for sure was that the young widow had become a pariah in our quiet neighborhood. Maybe that's why I talked to her that day. We'd both lost something, and we'd both been betrayed by people we thought we could trust. Or maybe I was just curious. When I told my parents I was going outside to toss a basketball around, they were thrilled. They had no idea that I only wanted an excuse to stand in the driveway so that I could wave at Jennifer Trent. "What you doing?" I called over to her, as she unloaded yet another sack of scrap metal from her back seat. The young widow stopped in her tracks, as though I caught her robbing a corpse from a graveyard. It took a long time for her to answer. I think it was hard for her to believe that one of us had actually talked to her. "I'm building something," she smiled finally. "Something very special." "Can I see?" "Not yet, but you'll see when it's finished. You all will." With that, Mrs. Trent heaved the sack onto her shoulder and trudged inside, leaving me more curious than ever about what she was up to. I took to riding my bicycle in careless circles around the cul-de-sac beside Mrs. Trent's house, waiting for her to come home so I could get a peek into the garage. When I finally got a chance, however, nothing was visible in the gloom, apart from well-organized tools, a grease can, and a bulky, sinister something covered with a canvas tarp. "If I didn't know better, I'd think you were spying on the neighbors," my father laughed after I pedaled irritably up the driveway that evening. It was the tone of voice he used when he was only half kidding, and I realized that my attempts to learn Mrs. Trent's secret hadn't been nearly as subtle as I thought. My parents were still worried about my unusual behavior, and if I didn't take a step back, I'd get caught for sure. It was just then, however, when I received the biggest break in my short career as a 9-year-old detective. It was one of the hottest days of summer, and our air conditioning unit had gone out. My mother drove us to the library while it was being fixed. As she thumbed boredly through a fashion magazine, I explored the children's section. And that was when I saw Jennifer Trent swoop through the door with an armful of books. She dumped them carelessly onto a trolley and approached the librarian for a hushed conversation, from which I only caught the words, "lucky," "rare volumes," "wouldn't do this for just anyone," and "interlibrary loan." Squatting behind the shelves, I snuck closer. The books that Mrs. Trent had returned and the ones she was checking out had a lot in common. They were all antique, battered tomes with titles like The Binding Ritual, The Book of Formation, and Advanced Robotics. A lot of them weren't even in English. I fixated on that last title. It was the only one I understood, and it seemed to provide a solution to the puzzle. My young, recently widowed neighbor was building some kind of machine. But why? That night, I discovered the terrible truth. Ever since I'd lost Hoops, I'd had trouble falling asleep. When I looked at the worn spot in the carpet where he'd lain at my bedside, A bitter taste flooded my mouth. It wasn't fair. How could people be so petty and cruel? Worse still, what if this was just how things were, and how they always would be? What if the whole world was run by people like the Hightowers? Wrapped in my dark thoughts, I gazed out the window at the gathering storm. The lights flickered on in Mrs. Trent's garage, and I suddenly realized that this was my chance. My parents were asleep. The streets were empty, and Mrs. Trent had left a stepladder leaning on the wall beside the garage door. If I climbed up it, I'd finally be able to see what was going on in there. I had scrambled out of my bedroom window and down the trellis often enough to know that I'd be in big trouble if I got caught. But this time, it seemed worth it. There was an anticipatory charge to the humid night air that added to the unreality of it as I walked barefoot through the damp grass, crossed the street, and set a single deuce-licking foot on the first rung of Mrs. Trent's aluminum ladder. I'd expected the whine of saws and the hissing crackle of an arc welder, but the house was oddly quiet. I climbed up another rung, then two, until my nose was almost touching the square patch of light that divided the ordinary, rational world I knew from the insanity that Mrs. Trent was brewing in her garage. It was like something out of a surrealist painting. The workbenches, scrap metal, and tools had all been pushed against the walls, leaving the concrete floor bare. Mrs. Trent had created concentric circles of chalk letters, colored powders, and flickering candles. At their center, the machine waited. Its 8 razor-tipped steel legs gleamed in the candlelight, and a scythe-like blade extended above its metallic body like the head of a hungry vulture. It was the size of a small table, and Jennifer Trent knelt before it, her arms extended, chanting. Her eyes sparkled. Her face was flushed with ecstasy, as an invisible wind blew through her hair. In that moment, she was the most beautiful and most terrible thing I'd ever seen. When the thunder rumbled and fat drops of rain began to splatter against my face, I barely noticed. All my thoughts were focused on what was happening inside that garage. Mrs. Trent reached into a brass jar that I later realized was her husband's urn. With an inhuman scream, she tossed a handful of his ashes onto the metal monstrosity in front of her. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, to my horror, one of those cruelly spiked steel legs began to move. There was a grotesque intelligence to the way the machine probed the concrete floor, as though testing the capabilities of its new body. It turned its bladed head from side to side, as though it could somehow see. Mrs. Trent backed away, her eyes wide with fear, but the machine ignored her. Like a huge, horrible spider, it skittered towards the garage door. Toward me. Hail pelted down as I sprinted back across the street. The cheap wooden trellis groaned and creaked beneath my feet as I scrambled up it, careless of the noise. I dove into my room and slammed the window, although I knew a half-inch of glass would do nothing against the mechanical horror that was now advancing down Mrs. Trent's driveway. The sharp tips of its 8 legs clacked against the concrete. Rainwater glistened on the cruelly curved blade of its head. When it reached the sidewalk, it turned in the direction of the Hightower house, disappearing into the rainy darkness as though it had never existed at all. Maybe it hadn't, I considered. Maybe this was what going crazy felt like. After all, machines don't move on their own or think for themselves. They don't hunger for vengeance, or hunt down and kill their prey. Do they? When Mrs. Trent's nightmarish creation still hadn't reappeared a few hours later, I forced myself to climb into bed. With the covers up over my chin, I stared out my window, sure that at any minute I'd see a hideous blade-like head and steel arachnid body blocking out the glow of the streetlights below. When I awoke, however, hazy sunlight was pouring into my bedroom. I let out a sigh of relief when I heard my parents bustling around in the kitchen. At least that terrible machine hadn't slaughtered us during the night. I was just about to go downstairs for breakfast when the phone rang. There was something foreboding about the sound that made me creep down the hall to my parents' room and pick up the receiver shortly after my mother did. Oh my God, they're dead. Murdered! Miss Buell's voice was so shrill I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Calm down, Emily, my mother replied matter-of-factly. One thing at a time. Who's dead? Clint and Karen Hightower. Oh, Beth, it's awful. You should have seen it. The window smashed in, blood everywhere, the wall and carpet all stabbed up. It's awful. I grimaced. It didn't sound like Emily Buell thought it was awful. It sounded like she was enjoying having inside information. And you know the worst part? Mrs. Buell went on. There were no fingerprints. The police have no idea who did it. Oh, Beth, I don't know what the world is coming to. Something so terrible happening in our quiet little neighborhood. Emily Buell kept rambling, but I wasn't listening. My mind was reeling from what I just heard. A machine like Mrs. Trent's would leave no fingerprints, and it would have been easy for it to burst through a window and hack apart the Hightowers. The stabbed-up walls and carpet must have been the result of its 8 pointed legs. I set the phone down and staggered to the window in a daze. Police, coroners, and even a local news crew buzzed around the Hightower house. Our neighbors pretended to work in their yards or check their mail while craning their necks for a better view. All except for one. Jennifer Trent ignored the hubbub at the end of the street. Instead, she grabbed a hose, a sponge, and a bucket of soapy water, and headed into her garage. The living room felt cold, as I imagined gore-reddened water swirling down the floor drain. But then, another, darker thought occurred to me. Hadn't the Hightowers gotten exactly what they deserved? They'd tyrannized our neighborhood for years, killed my dog, and Jennifer Trent seemed convinced that they caused her husband's suicide. Good riddance, I thought, and was amazed by how free I suddenly felt. I went upstairs to turn on my gaming console for the first time since Hoop's death, wondering if Mrs. Trent felt as free as I did. That night, I was jolted from sleep by a frantic knocking outside. I rolled over and checked my digital clock. 2:57 a.m. What the? My father murmured sleepily as he trudged down the hallway to a chorus of doorbells. Please, you've got to let me in. Emily Buell was screeching from the front porch. My mother's slippered footsteps hurried past my bedroom. The front door opened and closed. Emily, what's wrong? Have you got anything to drink around here? The neighborhood gossip's voice rattled like the ice in the glass my father was preparing for her. God, you'll think I'm crazy. It's okay, Emily, my mother soothed. Go on. I had just gotten out of bed to go to the bathroom when I had this weird feeling, like something was out there. Something that wanted to hurt me. And then I heard footsteps on my roof. Not normal footsteps, though. It was like some huge bug was moving up there. Even from the top of the stairs, I could hear my father's relieved sigh. Sounds like you got a raccoon in your attic or something. Those empty spaces can make little animals sound bigger than they are, This is not just some raccoon in my attic, Mrs. Buell sobbed. Somebody's trying to kill me, just like they killed Karen. I know what this is. This is revenge for what we've been doing. A tense silence followed Emily Buell's words. A silence that, of course, she couldn't resist filling. I might as well tell you. I at least want somebody to know why I died. Ice rattled. My father poured her another drink. You know I'm an accountant, right? Boring stuff, but Karen had this idea. She'd recommend me to businesses she didn't like, and I'd screw up their books on purpose. Nothing illegal, mind you, just enough to get them in tax trouble or make it look like they were going to go bankrupt. Then, when they sold off their business, Karen's real estate firm would buy the storefronts. Her clients would leave me nothing but good reviews, drowning out the bad ones from the previous owner. We'd split the profits. Emily sniffed. Look, I mean, how were we supposed to know that Arthur Trent was going to take the failure of his business so personally? Maybe he was ashamed. Maybe he was just depressed, but it's not like him killing himself was our fault. The confession was followed by another, longer silence. I think you should go, my father said acidly. But it isn't up for discussion, my mother added. I'd heard rumors about what happened to Arthur, but you don't even realize what a terrible thing you did, do you? I'm not just going to sit here and be insulted. Emily Buell stood with a huff and stomped to the door, her fear apparently forgotten. I won't forget this, she threatened, before slamming the door in my parents' faces. Emily Buell never made it home that night. Even though she'd always been the neighborhood gossip, the only person who noticed she'd gone missing was the paperboy, who'd seen his deliveries piling up on her porch. It's possible that no one would have related her disappearance to what happened to the Hightowers, if there hadn't been more murders. The police were stumped. After the third killing on Meadow View Lane, they put a media blackout on the whole thing. But I knew in my heart that they'd never uncover the truth. Because the truth was impossible. The truth was an 8-legged metal monstrosity with a scythe for a head that had been built to kill. I still remember the look on Mrs. Trent's face when the police interviewed her in her driveway about Emily Buell's disappearance. I know something you don't know, the young widow's smirk said. Something that's totally beyond your understanding. After the third killing, however, that smile faded, replaced by an expression that was haggard and drawn. Jennifer Trent hardly left her house anymore, but I noticed how large swaths of paint had been scraped away from her garage door, like something big had been scratching at it, wanting to be let in. When the killings didn't stop, I began to wonder whether Mrs. Trent had any control over her creation at all. I could understand why the machine had hunted down the Hightowers, and even Emily Buell, who had played her own part in Arthur's death. But what about old Sam Halstead, found laying in his living room floor with his face hacked apart? His door-to-door preaching and constant attempts to convert his neighbors had been irritating, uncomfortable even. But did that really merit a death sentence? Then there was Kelsey Healy, a high school sophomore whose only crime seemed to be playing her music too loud. Her blood-splattered Toyota Corolla was found on the main boulevard with its windshield smashed, its door hanging open, and its speakers cut to pieces. The law might have forbidden journalists from exposing what was happening on Meadow View Lane, but it could do nothing to stop the vicious grapevine of neighborhood gossip. Some of the details might have been wrong or exaggerated, but we all knew about the gruesome crimes almost as soon as they were discovered. Eavesdropping from my parents' bedroom, I overheard worried conversations about moving away or staying indoors until the killing stopped. People talked about the murders as though they were a storm that would just blow over, some sort of natural calamity that could be outlasted and avoided. But I knew better. I knew that Mrs. Trent's machine wasn't going to stop until everyone who'd ever offended the Trents was dead. And hadn't my parents snubbed Jennifer Trent after her husband's suicide? Just like everyone else? I was suddenly very, very afraid for my family. I began dropping hints about how I was sleeping badly, about how the news of what was happening in our neighborhood made me feel unsafe in my own house. I hinted that a vacation, even a short one, would do me some good. I knew I was being manipulative, but I also knew that I had to get my family away from Meadow View Lane before it was too late. A few nights later, my father announced that we were going to the beach for a week. I could tell from his haggard face that he needed to pull a lot of strings at work to get the time off, and felt a flood of gratitude toward the gruff, sheepishly grinning guy I called Dad. I threw my arms around him, relieved. We were going to get away in time. I started packing right away, loading books and toys into the child-sized backpack I took on family vacations. I was so focused on what I was doing that I barely noticed the sound of the backyard screen door opening. My parents were both inside watching TV. So, who was coming inside our house? By the time I heard the tip-tap of those 8 terrible legs on the kitchen floor, it was too late. What the? My father's cry was cut off by a swift, meaty thwack. My mother's footsteps thundered on the stairs as she ran to me. She pressed her lips against my bedroom door, whispering, "Hide under your bed, don't come out, no matter what." The machine's skittering steps weren't far behind her. In the dusty darkness beneath my bed, I shut my eyes against the awful sound. The worst part was that my mother's final warning didn't matter. I'd seen what that machine could do, and it would have no trouble hacking down the door and dragging me out of my hiding spot with those spined legs. But it didn't. When the gruesome noises from the hallway finally stopped, Mrs. Trent's machine scurried out of our house and into the night. Hours must have passed before I finally found the courage to climb down the trellis and knock on a neighbor's door. One frantic call to the police later, I was on the way to stay with my aunt in San Francisco. Between the loss of my parents and the media blackout, I never found out exactly what happened to those who remained on Meadow View Lane. Did it eventually become a street of ghosts with only Mrs. Trent left alive? Or did the young widow somehow find a way to stop what her creation was doing? I have no idea. When curiosity brought me back to my childhood street years later, however, what I discovered chilled me to the bone. Not one of my original neighbors remained. The new residents of Meadowview Lane spoke of abandoned houses and a sudden crash in property values. A godsend for young families searching for their first homes. There were dark insinuations that something bad had happened back then, but no one seemed to know exactly what. Some said a gas leak. Others blamed a disease outbreak or something in the water. The neighborhood kids were more helpful. When I asked a passing girl on her scooter what she thought of living on Meadowview Lane, she gave me the usual weary response that clever children give to unknown adults. "It's fine," the girl answered, then hesitated. "Except, I can't play in the woods like I could at my old house." She nodded at the woods at the end of the suburb, still undeveloped after all these years. "My parents say there are ticks, but that's not what I'm scared of." "Oh?" I prompted. "What are you scared of, then?" "Me?" The young girl squinted at the trees. A shadow crossed her face. "I'm just scared of the big metal spider." As she kick-pushed off into the gathering dusk, I returned to my rental car and left Meadowview Lane and all of its secrets behind for the second time. Become a channel member today for early access, bonus videos, and special emojis only available to members. Check out the description below or click the join button for more info. If you'd like another way to help support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon page at patreon.com/JordanGroupeHorror. As a patron, you'll get access to bonus videos and content. You'll be credited at the end of every video going forward, and if you decide to stay for 3 months, I'll name a character after you which will be featured in a Hollow's End story. Links to join the Patreon are in the description. Thanks everyone for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment to help the channel continue to grow. And see you again next time at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope you have a great night.